Good morning, everybody. Wonderful that you are here. You make time to be with us. Before starting the lecture, maybe it's good to have some background of me as well as a scholar, and then later I will give you some insight into my personal background. I started in the Netherlands studying anthropology. I call myself disciplinary nomad. So because I have been traveling around different disciplines. I started as an anthropologist, studying anthropology. Next to it, I started to do the second study of philosophy. And then for my PhD research, I went to the city of Nijmegen. I was started in Amsterdam, and then I went to Nijmegen, which is the eastern part of Netherlands. And then I worked within the gender studies department. I did my PhD there. And then I came back to Amsterdam in organization science department as an assistant professor. And then now we are working in sociology department. So you can imagine all these disciplines coming together. And that's why I position myself in different disciplines. And you will see also the insights I share with you comes from different disciplines. So I am very curious how you will see them, hear them, and interact with them. But when we talk about polyfocal governance or polyfocal forms of policy making, what do we mean with that? This starts actually, and you have probably heard or seen that there is a global attention for including the perspectives of minority groups we make policy about in the process of policy making and decision making processes. There is a global attention for it. And then the first question is, why do we do that? And one of the advocates in one of our projects actually answered that question, which is very insightful, very close to our experiences. He said, can you imagine that you are living somewhere in a city as an inhabitant, and there are all these decisions made about your living condition without consulting you? Can you imagine that? And that is what is often happening to refugees, for example. There are a lot of decisions made about them, about their asylum, about their integration process, about their inclusion in organizations, without having their perspectives included in that process. So that is not very positive for refugees, but most importantly, probably not very positive for decision-making process, because then you don't get the necessary connection to the life world of refugees to broaden the horizon of decision making. So it is inclusion of a variety of perspectives is important, not only for refugees and their future, but also for policymakers to make their horizon broader than only having one perspective included in that. But then the next question is, if we do that, how do we make governance or policy making or decision making in policy processes impactful? What is necessary to do that? It starts actually with, in the literature, we are talking often about participatory governance. It's a concept which has come up. And participatory governance is about including voices and perspectives of citizens in the decision making process. Most of us know actually the inclusion in advisory boards. Probably you have that as well in the way you're working. Advisory boards that brings people in, for example, refugees or asylum seekers, to discuss the issues about decision making and policy making. But then there has been also recently much broader, I have to say, forms of citizen perspective included in summits. Have you probably heard of citizen summits? Like there has been this David Rijbroek, who is actually a Belgian public figure, and he introduced this notion of G1000, so that you actually create citizen summits in the cities when you make decisions. For example, we had this in the Netherlands, in Amsterdam, that the city wanted to make a decision about energy and about how to make sustainable energy for everybody. And then they had the citizen summits. Many people were invited to share their thoughts about the policies in relation to energy sustainability. But what we actually see in that participatory approach of governance is very much based on this deliberative democracy, that actually the public space have to create space for voices of citizens to deliberate, to have conversations or dialogue with the people in position of power and decision making to make a change or to make it inclusive. What we see from our literature, that is important but not enough. Especially when we think about the work of Iris Marion Young, who has written about deep democracy. And deep democracy as a concept is actually about bringing deliberative democracy a step further. So deliberative democracy is a space where citizens can come and share their concerns and their views. But what happens with the people who are not allowed in these spaces, or people who are not used to take the space, public space, to share their ideas? So what do you do with silenced voices or marginalized voices? So deep democracy brings actually deliberative democracy one step further. How do we, with the question, how do we create space in democratic spaces or public spaces in the process of decision making for voices that are not used to be part of our conversation, or they are often also marginalized or even silenced in those processes because we want to have consensus and we don't want disruption in the processes very often. So even within the context of deliberative democracy, we want actually to have a kind of rationalized voices that are acceptable for us to include, but not so much, for example, emotional voices or voices that are not very similar to us or disrupt us. And then deep democracy is exactly the question of how to include those voices, the voices that we most of the time prefer to ignore. And then, if you think about deep democracy, a deeper notion of deliberation, then the issue of power becomes very important. Most of the time, when we think about power, especially in decision-making process, we think about power of position, people who are in position of power. So that actually is more kind of visible form of power. So you can pinpoint it, you can see, okay, who are the people who can make decisions. But more and more in the studies about governance and about social science, in social sciences, if you read more about other kind of power, the normalized, what we call normalized form of power. Power which is invisible. Power which is, if we think about Michel Foucault's concept discourse, discursive power. And what is discursive power? Discursive power is a network of words and images that are around us, influence us, without us realizing it. So we have certain kind of ideas, which is very contextual, very historically shaped, about ourselves and about groups that we do work with or make policy about. And these images and words are networks around us, and there is the power because they influence our thinking, our policies, our decision making without us realizing that it is working. So the power is in normalizing our thoughts and our actions without realizing. If you think about this, the power, normalizing power, discursive power, as power which is not visible, we cannot pinpoint, we cannot say, this person has that power. No, it is in a network. So it is very difficult to detect, very less tangible than the position of power, which is very much localized, connected to people. What is happening also recently is that this kind of power becomes even more strengthened, the power of images, through digitalization. So we see the you know the idea of algorithms. Algorithms in digital world makes us smarter. When we talk about smart cities, smart organization, when you have digitalization in order, but algorithms also homogenizes our thinking. So because algorithms actually shape in a way, feed us with certain kind of things that we like. So when you have a preference on the social media, you get all the images coming in that kind of direction. So in a way, smart makes us also poor in imagination because it feeds us with the same kind of things. It homogenizes our images and our thoughts. So in that sense, the normalization process of power becomes even more normalized through digitalization. So we become smarter, but not per se wiser. And I will talk about that. Wise in this case means to be able to connect to people who are different than us, to create connectedness in the world, to be more, to broaden our horizon and not be very much confined in the bubbles, I would say bubbles in terms of thinking or in terms of social interaction. Another point which is also strengthening this normalizing power is time. Thomas Halleh Eriksen, Norwegian anthropologist, has written this essay about tyranny of time. He says we don't have dictators in most of the countries we think about, but yeah, we have dictators, unfortunately, still. But the dictator is time because it dictates our actions. We are doing everything faster and faster and faster. We want to be more efficient, and digitalization is the idea makes us more efficient. So in that going fast, we also forget a lot. And one of the things we forget is multiplicity around us. I always, my context is the Netherlands, so I always use the biking. It's not, I see bikes here, but not as much as in the Netherlands. In Amsterdam, for example, I always say, people bike like crazy. So the most dangerous transporters in the Netherlands or in Amsterdam are the bikers, not the cars. So they go very fast, and the idea is to go from A to B as fast as possible. And then you go a path, you go that day in, day out, fast, and then once you get the flat tire. So you say, oh no, what should I do now? So you have to do sometimes the same path, you have to walk. And what happens in slowing down is that you see much more around you. So all the buildings you forgot when you were going fast, you see it. All the noises that you ignored because you were not paying attention, you hear it. All the smells even. So what happens is that when you slow down, you see more, so you see multiplicity around you that you have ignored while going fast. And that is also the power of normalization. We go fast because we want to get somewhere, but we forget about the process and what is needed to take care of in that process. So wisdom is also about seeing more of the multiplicity around us and not go too fast to forget it. So if we think about resisting power or resisting this kind of homogenization of thoughts and thinking, when we think about power of position, when we have, for example, suppressive power is top-down, or when people exclude you, you see them, you know where it is located. So most of the time, you go against it. And to go against power is more about demonstrating, going to the streets, or strike, so you know how to go against it. But when the power is normalized, it's discursive, it's everywhere and nowhere. It's not located in people, but it's located in a network which is not tangible. How do you go against it? What are the ways to disrupt that kind of normalizing power? how is it possible to resist it? And that is actually for us the main question. Because we know how to protest against the power that is visible, but we don't know always, especially when you are in the decision-making process, how to go against the power which is less visible. So in my work and in our work, we are working with a different word. When we talk about visible power, the word is against. But when we talk about normalizing power, the word is in between. So we have to create in-between actions or situations to disrupt normalizing power. And then this becomes a bit maybe difficult to follow what is in between, but let me first, before going there, explain one example from my own experience. The impossibility going against normalizing power. I have been born in Iran a long time ago, and I have been part of the Iranian Revolution of 1979 as an activist. I was at that time a Marxist activist, as a young girl, very active in the revolution. My role changed when I became an activist, because I felt that I can change not only Iran, but also the world. But as you know, what happened in Iran after, probably you know, after 2 years, this we call Spring of Freedom changed into the new kind of dictatorship. And I had to leave the country. So I became an asylum seeker myself. I came end of 80s to the Netherlands. And then what I faced was very interesting, because I come from a secular family. I was a Marxist activist. I was a human rights activist. I was a human rights activist at that time. And you enter a country, a welfare state like Netherlands, and I was puzzled. Because in Iran, I knew I was fighting against dictatorship. I was fighting against, for justice, for freedom. And so for me, it was very clear where the power was, who were the good guys, who were the bad guys. I knew I was on the, I believe I was on the right side of history, and the bad guys were on the wrong side of history. That is the divisions often made. I came to the Netherlands and I was facing these images, end of 80s, imagine 88, images of a refugee being helpless, needs help, Iranian women coming from Islamic background, probably suppressed by other men in the family, so not very emancipated. So I was like, and then this kind of othering with a big O, I was facing it every day on the streets, in the interactions, even with NGOs who were supposed to help me. And I was thinking, what is this? Because that was a different kind of power, and I didn't know what to do with it. I didn't know how do you fight people who want to come, you know, who are in conversation with you, even have very good intentions to help you, but other you, put you in this box. That was the kind of power I was completely unaware. You know, I didn't know how to do it. It was out of my any kind of. It took away my agency, my power to action towards it. So I was puzzled. That's why you can imagine that became part of my study to understand how to deal with it. So if I think about in between, and that is what we in all the work we have been doing, try to understand how do you resist this kind of power, which is everywhere, which is even with good intentions. Goes together with good intentions, but in a way that good intentions are translated, others you, does not give space for your perspectives, for your talent, for your competence, how to go about it. And again, we have 3 different points of action in between, we call it in between actions or in between situations. To start with is in between the lines. Often, especially in and that's, I'm curious about your context again, in the Netherlands, as an over-regulated society, rules are rules. So it would be very important to find spaces that are in between the lines. And then I work with this with this quote of one of the ex-ministers of the Netherlands, Hirschpaling, says, "In a space that we cannot capture in rules and regulations, something extraordinary happens, something meaningful, a moment of consideration for the specific aspect of someone's life situation, a moment of possible governmental and legal creativity." And I have again my example. When I came to the Netherlands as an asylum seeker, as you can imagine, I had to wait for the status. I couldn't start immediately, legally, I couldn't start with the language and with study. I had to wait. But there was possibility from the, at that time, universities, institutions, even governments, the city of Amsterdam helped me to follow a Dutch language course. They helped me with it, although it was not legal, but they found a way in between the lines. Vrije Universiteit was not allowed to accept me as a student, but still they did. I could start my study anthropology a year after I entered the country. And I was third year student anthropology when I got my status as an asylum seeker, as a refugee. So the fact that people were able to be creative enough not to go against the rules, but to find the ways in between the lines of regulations, to give me space to start immediately, has been essential. I always say, for me being successful and become a professor is one thing in the Netherlands. You have 5 people with other ethnic backgrounds who are female and full professor at the university. But in 3 years, the last 3 years, I have been also called one of the most influential Dutch people in the Netherlands, 200 most influential. So you can become very successful in a context if you get the chance to start immediately as a refugee or asylum seeker. Why is that? Because we did a lot of studies showing that the waiting period, which is actually after asylum, for in the Netherlands, the Dutch context is for years, for 3-4 years, can be really disastrous for asylum seekers because they enter the country with a lot of baggage that is negative, memories of suppression for most of them. And then if you are put in a waiting period, in a waiting room actually, without having the possibility to invest and develop yourself and be focused on the present and future, what happens is that you become prisoner of your memories, past memories, and that can lead to depression, to you lose your motivation, and after 3-4 years, when you have your permit, you have to start immediately without any motivation or even energy or even the mindfulness to build a new life. Mm-hmm. So what we do is that when we lose a lot as a society, when we are not able to build on the motivation and energy of the first years for refugees and asylum seekers to build new lives. And in reading in between lines and being able to create creativity in the governmental processes and in the policy making would be very important for that, to keep the energy and the positive energy which is in the first years, necessary to really build a new life. Learn a new language, you need everything, you learn a new language, study, and learn a new society. The second action would be in between individuals. And what do we mean with in between individuals? When I was studying anthropology and later philosophy, I came to this essay by Edward Said, Intellectual as Exile or Intellectual Exile. It's an essay which is, for me, it was very refreshing because, as you mentioned, I was considered all the time as a problem category, not only by policymakers, but also by academics, because refugees, exiles, or migrants are often considered to be in between spaces, and often with this duality as a frame. So you are either or, you are neither nor, you are, we don't know what is your loyalty, what is the source of belonging. You are lost in between the context. So the problem category is always defining in betweenness as a problem, as something which is actually abnormal. And that is, because of that, is problematic. What Edward Said in the essay does, which was refreshing for me and also very empowering at the time, was to turn it around. Say, okay, if we think about in-betweenness as a source of, of course, falling in between lines, get lost sometimes in the neither nor, but it can also be a source of originality, a potential for originality and creativity, because you cannot be normalized by one context. You have to always put different contexts as mirroring. You have to always, everything what happens in a new context, you cannot take it for granted because you have a different context to compare it with. So in-betweenness can be a source of, a potential actually, for originality, to question things that others take for granted. So the fact that you are constantly mirroring contexts or points of reference or reference frames in terms of culture, in terms of context, in terms of structures, can be actually a potential for reflexivity, a potential to question normalizing power. And it is a potential, it doesn't mean that it's actualized all the time. So it is potential that has to be worked on. It has to, in terms of capacity building, you have to really make it, embrace it as a source of creativity and originality. Otherwise, you just lose it. You don't see it even, because you are always a problem category. You don't see the other side. You have to really act on it and be more aware of it. And then he uses, Edward Said, this condition of exile as something that intellectuals or public intellectuals or people who want to make a difference, because intellectuals is not always a term we use these days, but people who want to make a difference in the world, in their societies, they can embrace that condition of in-betweenness and create it for themselves. So to create this element of mirroring context by including more diversity in their organizations, or really inviting people from different perspectives to their fora to discuss with them. So to bring in this contextual challenge or contextual unsettling, to also challenge this normalizing power. So what the condition of exile is something that he would say intellectuals have to embrace, to be able to also question status quo, to question the normalizing power. So to bring in creativity, we have to become in between individuals, all of us. But in this case, we have written a report in Dutch, which will be which is translated summary of it in English, in which we have actually identified, when we talk about refugee advocates, and they identify different groups in that. And one of the groups we talk about, which is very central to our report, is actually the advocates who have embedded stories. Embedded stories is that when you are part of decision-making process, sometimes you have in these advisory roles, you search for representatives of the group. It was the old version. Now we have individuals who come and tell their individual stories. And then it can also be ignored by policymaking. We have seen in the Netherlands happening. So, okay, it is one individual story like all others. So how can we make policy for one individual story? So it is important to unsettle some of the thinking, but it is not enough to really make the policy making political. But we talk about embedded stories are the stories that are less than representative but more than individual, somewhere in between. And what are these stories? These are the stories of advocates who have we make three different kind of consciousness as a kind of important element of that embedded narratives. They have practical consciousness. It means that they are living in a new context long enough to know how the things work, to be familiar with structures. So practical consciousness means you know how to navigate the structure a bit. So you are familiar with the current structure, current society you're part of. You have also reflective consciousness. So you have not left your country too long ago, which is too far away. So you are not completely assimilated in the new context, but you still have past and present in a kind of simultaneously present in your consciousness. So you are able to use the past and present as mirrors, so that you can actually be reflective about the structures you're part of, both structures, past and present, or more structures. So you question the structures because of this mirroring impact of the past and present. And the third element is relational consciousness, which is about advocates who have networks with other, with their soulmates, in this case refugees who have the large network with other refugees, and their stories, what they tell to the policymakers, is quite embedded in that network. So they not only tell their own story, but they share the patterns comes from those networks, the patterns of stories that comes from refugee experience. So in that sense, their stories are relational, based on relational consciousness. And these three elements are important to think about the in-between individuals that are from the refugee background, and they have not only embedded but also embodied experience of being a refugee in the policy-making process, which actually asks for different kind of receptiveness towards it. If they have and bring this knowledge, which is not individual and not representative is impossible actually, we figured out. But this is actually as close as you can get to the life world of refugees, and when you include that, it means that they have to have quite equal position in the reception of their ideas in the decision-making process. And the third aspect that I want to add is third form of in-betweenness in terms of actions is in-between spaces. In-between spaces, and also in our literature, we refer to as interspaces. These are spaces, imagine, that are different than the discursive spaces. As I mentioned, normalized power works through discourses. And discursive spaces, we are positioned in. It works. You know, when we are in conversation, these discourses are all over the place. And if we bring our ideas to the table, it's very much influenced by those discursive networks around us. In-between spaces are about spaces that you make space within the space. So within this discursive space, you make a choice to make a space which is empty of judgment. And one of the concepts we use from Theo de Boer, who's a Dutch philosopher, is epoche, which is a familiar concept actually in philosophy, in phenomenology, approach in philosophy. Epoche is about temporarily suspending your own judgment, or what we call it, to step aside, to visualize it. When you make a space, instead of coming into the space with your ideas and your thoughts and your opinions, you take a step aside to make the space free of judgment and free of all these subjective ideas that comes to the space. When you do that, it makes possible to listen to the story of other from the position of other. So you create a possibility for deep listening. Instead of bringing the ideas in, you create the space for listening and different form of connection to diversity. When you listen, when somebody presents a story, in a space, in the interspace or in between space, which is empty of judgment, you hear the story of a person and not the other with a capital O. You see a story of somebody with struggles, with concerns, with problems. But then the problems are not problem categories you have in your mind, but problems are really connected to the life world of people that you are talking with. And when that happens, when the stories come and when you are able to listen to them in deeper sense and depart from their position, authority is a term, approach them from their position, you see completely different. You can replace and change your position temporarily to see different things, to broaden your horizon, to see more of the worlds we are part of. And alterity is a term comes from Jewish philosopher Emmanuel Levinas, who has been also very inspiring for us, both of us, because Elena has also a philosophical background, when we do philosophy, and in that you know that Western philosophy has very much the subject, the individual, as a point of departure. And Levinas have criticized that after the violence of Second World War against Jewish population, he said, that one of the problems maybe has been that we depart always from the self, but we need to depart from the other, and then the other does actually ask for our responsibility, in a way that we create a shared responsibility for the world when we approach from the other instead of from ourselves. And that's why the concept of authority has been so appealing to me, to consider it if you really want to, especially when make connections or having this relational capacity, develop it, especially when the other is so, with a big O, is the capital O, is so different from us and so distant from us. We need to have methodologies or spaces that makes it possible to come closer, to bring our world closer, our life world closer to the life world of the other, but also our sustained world, in a way we are positioned within the structures and systems and governments, closer to the life world of the people whom we make policy about. So I think it's almost time to come to the conclusion. I have been talking a lot. It's okay, you are still with me. We have a lot of, I really would love to have your feedback and conversations and your positioning in the story. But to conclude, actually, to give the potential of this, what I called in-between actions against this normalizing power, we need to really work on the competences of all actors involved in the process of decision making. And all the actors involved, most of the time when we talk about capacity building, we talk about capacity building of the people with problems. We want to empower them. But capacity building in our case is about everybody. So for policymakers, it's important to have the capacity building, to see more, to listen better, and to also be receptive to the moments when the perspective of the other becomes disruptive. As I mentioned, in participatory spaces or participatory governance, we tend to actually exclude disruptions. But as I mentioned earlier, for normalizing power, disruption is essential to see differently and to broaden our horizon. So we have to have the capacity, and that is very important, to develop the competence. It's very difficult because we are very much, we want to be consensus, we want to have consensus, but we have, how we do go about disruptions, what is the competence to have, for example, in between spaces, to accept disruption, but be also careful that it doesn't become a kind of panic zone, that people, it creates more distance. So to find a balance between, to come from disruption to connection, or to broadening the horizon. That is the competence which is very necessary for policymakers or NGOs who are working with refugees to develop that, to bring in different ideas and views, perspectives, to disrupt their own normalizing power and to make better connections, and deeper listening. But also for the refugees, refugee advocates, it's very important to build the competence so that they can actualize their potential, as I mentioned, the potential competence or being creative because of all these elements of consciousness I mentioned, potentially there, but you have to make it actual, you have to make that transformative. How do you do that? How do you embrace all these elements of possibility of reflectiveness and also creating relational consciousness? How do you translate it into really have conversation with policymakers, people in position of power, so that they listen to you and then you can really cooperate and co-create difference. And then from these capacity buildings from all the actors, we come to capacity sharing. And then it is important to bring all these perspectives together and create a connectedness that we can influence and enrich each other in that process. And for that, we work with spaces. Gaventa has talked about different spaces in which policymakers most of the time engage with refugees. And one of the spaces is, most of the time, the closed spaces, they are not spaces in which the minorities, in this case refugees, are included, but we have very often invited spaces. That is actually the most dominant way of including refugee voice, and you mentioned the digital possibility platform, or we have advisory possibilities that you invite people into the space. But what's happening in most of these spaces, as I mentioned, either the refugees come in and they don't feel really heard because the frame is very much set and they are invited to say something, but it is not really a deep invitation. It's actually kind of maybe framing more than really deep engagement with the perspectives that they bring. Or the refugees that come in, they have individual story, but then individual story isn't just interesting for the moment, but it's not really taken into consideration for considering or reconsidering the policy. So that is very important, that invited space as we shape it is not really based on in-between, the condition of in-betweenness. And then we have created spaces that often the refugee advocates themselves create spaces and invite policymakers to come in, and then they are invited in their space. In that sense, there is connection, but that can have also some limitations, because it can be very inspiring, but if it is not a space that policymakers themselves own as their own space, then it can also be forgotten. It can be a kind of inspiration, but forgotten. So in our work, we talk about co-created spaces, that are spaces that actually policymakers, but also NGOs or all the people who have in a way, in a position of influencing the refugee inclusion and integration and refugee advocates, they co-create this space together so that also they co-own the space. So when you are co-owner of the space, then you can also see the value of this connectedness to bring in different perspectives. And for co-creative spaces to really be transformative, you have to create this space for polyfocality of perspectives. So, and value them equally. So think about, these perspectives are important and valuable, to think about it and bring it together. And from that co-creation, think about transformative policymaking that are really impactful for the lives of people we're talking about, because all the efforts and all the intentions of policymaking is to make a difference. And then we can make a difference when we have these co-creative spaces, but for that to work, we need to first invest in capacity building of all the actors, and then bring in capacity sharing. I think that would be my talk for now. Thank you so much for your attention. Thank you.